This is Dialogue. Dialogue, a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
This is Dialogue Assassination with Research Specialist Mae Brussel. For KLRB, I'm Gloria.
Hey, thanks everybody for joining tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about Mr. John Lennon and his untimely assassination. But first, remember what Mae says, there's no safety in silence. You people that sit there and don't speak up or shout, I'll shout until I die. And when I saw those people and I knew they died, I said I'd rather live 1 hour the way I'm living than to sit here like a zombie and let it happen, not to speak up. And that's why we're here today. Indeed, that's why we are here today. So John Lennon, there's so much to talk about with his assassination. And he was shot and killed out in front of the Dakota apartments, New York City, December 8th, 1980. And Mae had actually met John and Yoko in on July 28th in 1972 in San Francisco. And she and her family had gone to the last Beatles concert in Candlestick Park in 1966. And John Lennon funded the Realist magazine anonymously, which Mae wrote for. It was kind of subversive left magazine. And John Lennon was known as kind of the new left. And of course, as a member of the Beatles for a long time, he achieved a lot of fame, and people followed him and they paid attention to what he said. And he also was kind of against religions, and that stuck in some people's minds as well. So I want to start out by reading this, and forgive me, it's a little tedious, but it gives you the background, what Mae was thinking and what was going on at the time. And this is an interview that Mae did, and it's from, I believe it's from 1980-81, and it's with Tom Davis. And this is her 11th year of broadcasting of Dialogue Conspiracy. And, he's asking, hey, what would be the motive to kill John Lennon? And, he'd been in seclusion for 5 years, and he had the bed in, and he was just kind of coming out of that with Yoko Ono, and he had kind of disappeared from the public face, and he had been like enjoying time with his son and kind of retrenching and deciding what he wanted to do. And this was kind of his coming out period in December or in 1980. And Mae says, the date of his murder and the careful selection of this particular victim are very important. 6 weeks after Lennon's death, Ronald Reagan would become the president, and Reagan and his soon-to-be appointed cabinet were prepared to build up the Pentagon war machine and increase the potential for war against the USSR. And the first strike would fall on small countries like El Salvador and Guatemala. And we, indeed saw wars in El Salvador and Guatemala and hit squads. And Lennon, she says, alone was the only man, even without his fellow Beatles, who had the ability to draw out 1 million anti-war protesters in any given city within 24 hours if he opposed those war policies. So we knew what happened to other anti-war protesters in the 60s and how the FBI COINTEL program was set up to denounce, or in some cases, get rid of these people. She says that Lennon was a spiritual force. He was a giant like Gandhi, man who wrote about peace and brotherly love, and he taught an entire generation how to think for themselves and challenge authority. So Lennon and the Beatles song shout out the inequalities in life and the message of change, and change is a threat to the longtime status quo that the Reagan team exemplified. So remember, the Reagan team out of California was involved heavily in MK Ultra, and George H.W. Bush, the head of the CIA, was his vice president. And indeed, they tried to kill Reagan to get George Bush installed as president. And really, that just kind of sent sent Reagan to the back room at that point in time, where he would watch his cowboy movies, and the secret team, George Bush's secret team, was basically in charge at that point in time. And May says, she's been talking about this, and on her December 7th radio program, so the day before he was shot, killed, said that the old assassination teams are coming back into power, and the very people responsible for covering up the murders of President JFK, RFK, MLK, for Watergate, Koreagate, kidnapping and murder of Howard Hughes, and for hundreds of other deaths, had only 6 weeks before they'd again be removing or silencing those voices of opposition to their policies. And Lennon was coming out once more. His album was cut. He's prepared to be part of the world, which was a worse place since the time he'd withdrawn with his family, and it was sure bet that Lennon would react and become a social activist again. That was the threat, that Lennon realized that there was a danger coming back into the public view, and he took that dangerous chance, and we all lost. So the interview says, the common assumption is that Mark David Chapman, who in theory shot him, was arrested the moment he shot Lennon, was acting out of his personal love-hate relationship with Lennon. We're going to go into Mark David Chapman pretty deep. And, hey, May, why do you have to look for a larger conspiracy than the conflicts in Chapman's own head? So single crimes of passion, May says, are easy to explain and easy to solve. Somebody's gunned down who is controversial, has political enemies, is hated by the wealthy and well-organized religious movements, is an open opponent of government policies at home and abroad. That kind of murder requires much more inquiry into the background of the assassin, and the conclusions about the murder motive may turn out to be simple, yet in every political assassination since 1963, there was always more unanswered questions that led to a broader supposition of intention to kill by a group of people rather than just a single individual. And she'll talk about that in the Assassination Chain, that we'll look at in a few minutes. So she's saying, hey, what is the clue that you look for of suspicious of a larger conspiracy? And May says there's many necessary connecting links in every assassination conspiracy. If any link of that chain falls apart, becomes exposed, then the parts of the larger plot are more visible. With every element that the chain holds together is present in the evidence and testimony regarding any particular murder, there has to be a larger conspiracy. And we'll look at that diagram in a minute. And she says that the most important link in the chain is the selected decoy or patsy. So whoever's arrested at the scene of the crime, to the exclusion of other suspicious persons, becomes the assassin. So you're talking about Lee Harvey Oswald and Mark David Chapman, Sirhan, James Earl Ray. Like they're arrested at the scene, and the focus becomes on them to the detriment of any physical evidence that exists. And they just focus on that single person, and they've armed him and located him at the scene of the crime. The letters and diaries always present and easily located to support the predetermined cover story, just like the passports on 9/11. They somehow survived, while 3 buildings brought down by 2 airplanes did not survive, but the passport survived, just like the diary of Lee Harvey Oswald survived, most likely written by E. Howard Hunt. And so in preparation for this act, the decoy is moved, or patsy is moved across the country or overseas, traveling, staying at safe houses. He doesn't have any friends, no job, no means of support, while at the same time staying at fancy hotels, spending a lot of money, getting phone messages, meeting a lot of people. Very few people have the money to spend years in transit like these patsies. And you can see the same thing with James Earl Ray and with Lee Harvey Oswald, went to the Soviet Union. And, whose chances of being in these selected locations at the precise moment when their victim is murdered are minute and impossible without assistance, she says. So who was Mark David Chapman, and what are the background that made you suspicious that he's been selected as a decoy or patsy by other persons who wanted Lennon dead? And she says that he came from a conservative military family who'd moved from Fort Worth, Texas to Florida. He had to become a Jesus freak at the time Lennon and the Beatles were getting death threats during the anti-war period, joining at this moment while supposedly loving and admiring Lennon as a gross contradiction. For the religious fundamentalists were furious that Lennon was considered himself better known and loved than Jesus. She says that in DeKalb County, Georgia, just east of Atlanta. It figures prominently in Chapman's life, just as it had some years earlier in that of Martin Luther King. And in 1977, in a court affidavit, Robert Byron Watson, former employee of the Magellan Art Gallery, Atlanta, named several citizens having planned and bragged about the future murder of Reverend Martin Luther King. King's death came about just one week after these plans were discussed, and these same people also talked about murdering Senator Robert Kennedy. And then Chapman, and so Chapman is connected to the art galleries. He owns art that it's implausible, improbable that he would be able to afford. So she'll talk about that in a few minutes. And Chapman attended the DeKalb Junior College in the area where these kind of plans were laid and political anger was being vented. And he was from there. He was sent to Beirut, Lebanon. Well, what the heck was going on in Beirut, Lebanon? He was handed funds both ways, just like Lee Harvey Oswald. And Beirut was the center of George Habash. And the CIA assassination teams were also identified in the Watson testimony before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1977 and 1978. So this was a training center for CIA assassinations in Beirut, Lebanon. And, Mark David Chapman, no job, just a regular guy, just ends up over there and on a tour on vacation, I guess, in Beirut. And March 31st, 81, UPI exposed the connection of military training and guerrilla camp in Beirut, Lebanon to the worldwide Nazi ties. And after 6 months in Lebanon, he went to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, to work with Vietnam refugees recently arrived from Southeast Asia. Members of the CIA were with him at this military base. So what was going on at that point in time? Well, they were bringing back people from the Phoenix program, William Kobe's Phoenix program, to be trained. And they were training people for death squads in South America. And I don't know where that School of the Americas was, the death squad training grounds that they had in the United States. I think it might have been in Florida.
Fort Bragg.
Fort Bragg. Okay. Yep. So this in that milieu of the Phoenix program where he was working, and it was staffed with agents who were hated the anti-war people, social activists like John Lennon. They had the intent and the means to move persons like Chapman to their training camps and then to specific places planned as sites for future assassinations. And Colby came back to the U.S. to become the director of CIA at the time when Operation Chaos was in full swing against the hippies, rock musicians, anti-war protesters. Many of them were killed or otherwise neutralized. She has a big list of all the rock musicians who were killed or otherwise neutralized, or, they met an improbable Arkansas type death. So from there, he went to Lookout Mountain, Tennessee, and let's see, he went to Lookout Mountain, Tennessee, and then he attended a Presbyterian college. And MLK was a victim of plans made in DeKalb, Georgia, was murdered in Memphis, Tennessee. Senator Howard Baker was from Tennessee, and CIA Director William Kobe were making deals to cover up Watergate crimes in 1974, 1975, before Chapman moved to Tennessee. So there's so much happening in those 10 years, like 1966 to 1976, or even 15 or 20 years in there, where the COINTELPRO program is up and going, the Operation Chaos to control the left, the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, and they were neutralizing people, shall we say. So according to news reports, he fled to Hawaii in 1976, and he has an arrest record in Florida, but the authorities blame that on somebody else with the same name, the same birth date, the same specs as Mark David Chapman, but they said it wasn't him. And many patsies are given deals to keep them quiet, or keep them out of jail if they just follow the program. And that was part of all the training in the Vacaville prisons, let people out early if they follow the program, the MK Ultra program. And was there any connection between the Florida identification and the reason for Chapman's flight to Hawaii, she asked. And Hawaii, that's the scene of a lot of crazy stuff, like the East-West Center, for where they brought people from the third world over to train them, the CIA and then the University of Hawaii, MK Ultra programs. And many CIA Vietnamese and members of special forces safely removed from Vietnam were assembled in Hawaii. The Nugan Hand Bank, the Australian conduit for CIA heroin money, actually assassination fund, she says, kept a branch in Hawaii. And Herbert Mullen, convicted of mass murders in California, appeared perfectly normal until we sent to a military hospital in Hawaii. And it was in Maui that he went through his religious thinking that evolved as a killer. Ed Sanders, author of The Family, book about the Manson family, obtained documents regarding a mysterious trip Mullen took to Hawaii before he later became a program killer. So just imagine this is also where Barack Obama got his training and grew up, is in Hawaii at the East West Center, where his mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, met Barack Obama Sr. And I'm looking for connections there. If anybody has connections to that, to look into. So from 76 to 78, his biography is murky, limited employment and mental treatment. And allegedly he was in the hospital for a mental breakdown. On the other hand, if there were any evidence of mental instability, how did he get his murder weapon? Like, wouldn't he be denied if he was, his permit application should have been denied if he was mentally unstable. And there's a lot of months when he could have been programmed to be like the Manchurian candidate, specifically to murder Lennon. If and when he re-entered public life, Lennon was not a threat until the U.S. was getting close to another war. So May always thought that World War III was coming, and I think, there were little smaller wars, and of course the invasion of the Middle East and 9/11 and a set of wars, but we haven't had I think the United States has been at war ever since then, but there hasn't been a giant world war, but there have been many regional wars just going. And so subsequently, Chapman took a long vacation and a trip around the world, and he made a trip to Switzerland to meet a pal from DeKalb County, and the same guy who arranged his trip to Lebanon. And then he went to London and got a rare visit to a live John Lennon concert. And Chapman's wife, who worked for the travel agency, arranged his itinerary. The source of his money for his fares, hotels, food, concerts has never been identified, although Pacific Holding Limited, a tourism company formed by the CIA and special forces, may be implicated. Both groups had funds to hire assassination teams. So when he left his job in Hawaii in October of 23rd, 1980, he flew to Georgia. From Georgia, went to New York City with the intention of killing John Lennon, but he was apparently able to resist the master inside himself, a conflict he describes, and returned to Hawaii. So his program wasn't quite strong enough. He was able to resist. But before long, Hawaii was again behind him, and he arrived in New York on December 5th with a specific plan to kill John Lennon, which he did 3 days later. So Tom says, the interviewer, hey, this is only circumstantial. There's no proof. And, what proof of conspiracy do you have? And she says, well, the burden of proof of conspiracy is on the private investigator. The common denominator in all these cases are those links in the conspiracy chain, which show the relevant questions to be asked. Were there other persons along with Chapman shooting at Lennon to make sure he died? Who fled the scene in a hurry, never to be sought again by law enforcement agencies? Why did New York police adamantly refuse to accept pictures of Chapman autographing an album earlier in the evening of the murder? So earlier in the evening, Lennon signed an album for Mark David Chapman, and there is a picture of that. And then why were these donated to the newspaper after the police refused to accept them? So when Chapman's wife was called by the New York police, why did they instruct her, don't release any pictures of him? So these are parts of the assassination chain that needed to hold together. And then how could the Miami police issue an erroneous description of a criminal record having the same last name, date of birth, race, approximate height as a slaying suspect? Can we ever see the picture of the Florida suspect? If Chapman was treated for mental illness in Hawaii, how did he procure the weapon in Hawaii? How did he transport the gun from Hawaii to the mainland. And this question is dismissed by the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms agents, who said no investigation was in progress. So they weren't watching him. So, they wouldn't have caught that. Somehow money was never a problem. They lived in a nice apartment, able to support a hobby of collecting expensive works of art, owning an original Norman Rockwell lithographs worth $7,500, and traveling around the world. If there's some kind of occupation that provides the money for these luxuries, what is it? Because he didn't have a job. And let's go a little further. So Chapman's intention to find Lennon as just another adoring Beatle fan must be separated from the question of who transported him from Hawaii to Georgia to New York, back to Hawaii, back again to New York, with lots of cash for the sole purpose of murdering or killing John Lennon. So this is really similar to James Earl Ray's journey as well around the world. And Jimmy Breslin, New York columnist, was impressed that Mark David Chapman could be such a good shot with no military background at all. But she says that Chapman had been trained to shoot. He learned to become a security guard in Georgia before his trip to Lebanon and to the many other countries where he could have been instructed in killing. What about Fort Chaffee? Why not shooting practice in Tennessee? What about the military bases in Hawaii? What gives Breslin, the New York Daily News, the right to make such a statement without an inkling of Chapman's background? So they're just covering up, not delving into things. Like other lone drifters, he stayed at expensive hotels. His last evening before killing Lennon was spent at the Sheraton Hotel in New York, carrying $2,000 in cash along with his credit cards. Where to get all these cards, and what basis was the money earned and saved established credit to qualify for these cards? And Tom says, you apparently believe that there was a government conspiracy to assassinate and silence John Lennon, which was constructed by the same people who murdered other political figures and musicians in the past 18 years. And she says, absolutely. The federal government has maintained active programs to eliminate rock musicians and disrupt rock concerts. And Frank Church's committee hearings in 1975, FBI COINTEL programs clearly document the intent to break up gatherings of the New Left. Nothing brought anti-war demonstrators together with political messages more effectively than music festivals. And she does talk about Altamont and the Hells Angels killing there, where they kind of set that up to create conflict and to keep people away from rock concerts or gatherings. That was their version of social distancing back then, I suppose. And there's hard evidence that CIA assigned agents to investigate the music industry. We actually have John Lennon's FBI file, and after the murders of Tim Buckley, Jim Croce, Mama Cass Elliot, more information surfaced about the earlier mysterious deaths of Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin. She has a list of those, but not updated for the last year, and others have died since the Tom Charles Houston plan and the FBI COINTEL program were activated. And they've been taking if they've been taking any kinds of drugs, there's a distinct possibility that specific poisons were added to their drugs enough to be fatal to make it appear that they had died from a simple overdose. So hopefully, that provides a little bit of an information around May's thoughts on what was going on into the killing of John Lennon. And she did at least 6 hours of broadcasting about Lennon's death. And it was primarily about the assassination teams and the connections and the connections to Japanese industrialists, Yoko Ono being connected. She wasn't a fan of Yoko Ono. And these assassination teams, because she felt really connected to John Lennon and his music. She brought her family to the last concert at Candlestick Park in 1966, and she met with John Lennon in 1972. He was a supporter of her work, so she felt very connected to what he was doing, and was really impacted and affected by his murder. And it did fit the pattern of all the other political murders and assassinations that she was looking at. And what what was going on at this time also to be aware of was that there were powerful forces lined up against John Lennon. I think they set him up with like a marijuana bust, and they wanted to deport him back to England. And Strom Thurmond says that he wanted to deport Lennon because he's associated with radical elements of the New Left and working to dump Nixon, as documents show. And you can see all the people who worked to dump Nixon or to keep him from getting elected in 1972. A lot of them ended up in a bad way, including, as we saw, Ted Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and others who got in the way of Nixon found themselves face down in a pool of blood somewhere. And so Strom Thurmond says that this should be considered at the highest level. And this is part of the FBI file here. So there's an informer's report in March of 1972, Julie Maynard, about her trip to New York, says that Lennon sent a message that he would come to the demonstrations at the Republican National Convention in Miami if they are peaceful. So he wants to do a peaceful protest, and that kind of reminds me of what happened recently at the Capitol, peaceful protest with agent provocateurs. And the FBI told the courts and the public they'd been conducting a legitimate criminal investigation of Lennon because they had information that he's intended to participate in a violent, disruptive demonstrations in Miami. Whereas he's saying, yeah, I'll come if it's peaceful. And the FBI went all the way to the Supreme Court to prevent this document from being released to the public. And it totally undermines the entire pretext of the FBI's investigation of Lennon. So he's not a violent person. So this is the conspiracy chain that May had put together. And she wrote this. And on the right, here's the list of all the people that she had listed out to date that had been killed, including John Lennon. And it wasn't necessarily that they were killed, but they were very suspicious deaths of people who didn't fit the profile of supporting the status quo. And I know this is probably a little bit hard to see, but the conspiracy chain, and she's saying that, hey, you have to it's involved all the way up to the Supreme Court with lawyers and judges, the president, there's a motive, the National Security Council, then there's a victim, and there's some gunmen, there's a patsy and a decoy involved, and the Secret Service and guards have to be involved. And we saw this on the Epstein murder. The guards were involved. They, turned off the cameras. They left the room. They let happen whatever happened. The police and the squads are on the police, the FBI. Then there's experts. So people who are in charge of the handwriting or the psychiatrist. So Lewis, Julian West comes to mind. All the MK Ultra people who cover up, and they go in and they mind control Jack Ruby or other witnesses or people who are involved in the assassinations. And there's the government agencies, the defense industry, CIA, Pentagon. Then the evidence is forged, missing, altered, locked up, or delayed. So just think about all the evidence around RFK's murder, where there were 10 shots for like a I don't know what it was, like a 7 or 8 shot gun, and there were 10 plus bullets and shots, and then they pretty much destroyed the whole room and all the evidence, and they kept focusing on the patsy. And then you see how they bulldoze buildings that are evidence where these things happen, and then they just ignore the witnesses. They don't call the witnesses. As in the Warren Commission, they just ask them circular or irrelevant questions to kind of cover up. And then the State Department, the ATF, then the news media, books, radio, TV. So we think about Mark Lane writing books and shielding the truth and sucking up like a black hole all evidence and information, never to be seen again. And then there's legal staff where the attorneys for the prosecution and the defense are actually working together. And I just finished this book, Program to Kill by Dave McGowan, that talks about the serial killers. And he goes into at length how the prosecution and the defense teams work together to put these people away with virtually no physical evidence and uh, a lot of evidence of conspiracies or additional people involved in these murders and alibis that just get covered up and the people get railroaded with no physical evidence because they need somebody to convict. And the lawyers and the judges are heavily involved in that. And May goes into this, but this book shows it just over and over and over how that process works.
And there's money to be made with that. These guys make money. Bugliosi
Yep.
in the Manson stuff, man. He covered up so much stuff. I read a book that revealed that he was just hiding so much information, but he's making millions off of his Helter Skelter book.
Yeah, they get paid. They get the rights to the books, and then they just rabbit hole all the true information to keep the conspiracy from coming to light, keep the patsy under the thumb, and keep the focus on the one person who can't defend themselves, the patsy. And then, the defense attorneys working with the prosecution and the judges, it is very ugly. Okay, so May says, hey, this is similar to the Nazi murders done to silence political opponents in 1922 to 1933 as they came to power. And that makes some sense because of all the Nazi connections to these assassination teams. And she says that in the early 60s, Reinhard Gehlen was working with Otto Skorzeny in Spain and in Europe to set up the CIA and the National Security Council. And she specifically points out this guy named Richard Allen, which I haven't really gone into, but I wanted to mention his name because she spends a whole hour talking about this guy's connections to the assassination teams. And she says that, he traveled around, Chapman traveled around and met with all these people and was trained and mind controlled in these different places. But nobody's tracking any of that. Nobody's investigating it. It ties back to the death of all the other musicians. And she talks about Dr. Kruger hypnotizing Freddie Prinze and giving him his gun when he was depressed, just setting people up. So this is like the murder scene, 75th off of Central Park. And last time I was in New York, we walked by here, and this is the Dakota. And then here's like Lennon and Yoko coming out of the front door right where he was shot. And then this is the photo that they didn't want you to see, giving the autograph to Mark David Chapman 6 hours before he was shot. And then here's the main entrance where he was killed. He was shot at 5 times and hit 4 times. And there's some discrepancy as to that they mention, which I couldn't really figure out, about he being wounded on the left side where Chapman was standing to the back and to the right of him, so that he couldn't have shot him in the ballistics. And I didn't get too far into that, but there was some question as to could he have actually, from where he was standing, created those wounds. And so after he was shot, the doorman said, do you know what you have just done? And he said, yeah, I just shot John Lennon. And then he sat down and he was reading his copy of Catcher in the Rye. And then the police showed up and said, hey, this guy looks like a banker or a regular guy. There's no way that this guy shot John Lennon. What the hell is going on here? And the doorman said, no, this guy shot John Lennon, right? He fingered him. And so what's interesting is that yeah, May says, hey, how can people solve a crime in 12 hours? You know, she talks about the control of Candy Jones. She's blown away. They could solve the case in 12 hours. It's like Osama bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, right? Mark David Chapman. You know, they just, if they say it enough times, then it just gets sunk into your consciousness. And, you know, she talks about all of the incidents that happen, and these are just to get started, right? The Beatles' last show, their manager is killed in a car accident. And I didn't get a chance to look into that, but I could imagine it might be Princess Diana style car accident. And then Caesar shoots RFK in June of 1968, associated with Lockheed Martin. And she says in November, so he was killed in December. Hey, the rock musicians are going to have a hard time with Reagan administration back in office. And this was in November. He was killed in December. And then the media goes into, oh, what a great marksman he was. So that's what they're focused on. And the psychiatrists are obfuscating the whole thing. You know, he may have had an identity crisis, and it was really a motiveless crime. But what happened later was that People magazine came out with a story, which I'm going to read part of this to you. Jose Cenejos Perdomo, a man of many aliases, and was chief of police during the Cuban president Carlos Prios regime, so prior to Castro, and he went into exile after Fidel Castro took power and was recruited by the CIA. So Perdomo is recruited by the CIA. He was working at the CIA Miami station in early 1960s, and he recruited most of the members of Operation 40, the CIA hit squad that was charged with killing Castro and performed other assassinations. And it just so happens that he was working as the night doorman at the Dakota on December 8th of 1980 when John Lennon was killed, and told the police that Mark David Chapman was the assassin. A fact unmentioned by the commercially controlled media until March 1987. So 7 years later, when Jim Gaines described him in People magazine as an anti-Castro Cuban who discussed with Chapman about the Bay of Pigs invasion and the assassination of JFK. And there's a link here to that article, but it says a little more on this guy. He was the anti-Castro Cuban exile, worked closely with convicted Watergate burglar and known CIA agent Frank Sturgis, who trained Cuban exiles in preparation for the Bay of Pigs operation in 1961, and is also cited in connection with the RFK assassination. And I have Jose connected to Operation 40. So I know like Orlando Bosch was present at the Kennedy assassination, JFK, and all these anti-Castro Cubans, and that Operation 40 was set up by Allen Dulles. And, you know, they had bases for training for assassinations all over the place. So what a coincidence that this guy was the night doorman, the night that John Lennon was killed. Yeah. So there's so much to uncover. And, you know, May goes a little bit into Yoko's background, and she came from an industrial connected family in Japan. And she says that Yoko had John hypnotized before he went into his 5-year sabbatical, and that she was controlling him financially. You know, I think a lot of people kind of felt that, but that's a little bit more difficult to investigate. And that these hit squads had a lot of connection back to that Nugan Hand Bank, which was the CIA heroin bank, and to the right-wing crew in Japan. So there's a lot here, and there's a lot more to investigate. But just the fact that this guy was a doorman says a lot. Yeah, and that's it. So Amos, Mike, what do you guys think?
Wow, man. It's it's, you know what, I mean, I can't talk about Perdomo because I don't want to be perceived as a racist, you know. But joking aside, no, I mean that's too much, man. I mean, yeah,
Isn't it? Well, it's a coincidence. Just a coincidence.
yeah. No, he's just a hard working stiff, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
he's
just
just
had tough times from Cuba.
yeah,
No,
it
man.
just he just happened to be working as a doorman. You know, the guy who runs the hit squad.
Right. And you know what? I mean, you looking at the Lebanon stuff. I mean, you know, what's going on in Lebanon? I mean, who's running Lebanon? It's Mossad. You know, I mean, really,
Yeah,
you know. So I mean, there's so much stuff that it's really murky and dirty with this whole thing. So I mean, really, man, beautiful work.
yeah. Thanks, Amos. I mean, there's it just goes on like the layers and layers and layers, and I love the way that May puts together that assassination chain and that working through Dave McGowan's work, seeing how all these people work together to cover up the crimes, and you can see that they just point to lone assassin, lone nut, right? Oh well, the Uvalde shooter, he just so happened to have a $75,000 new truck and $5,000 worth of weapons and ammo, and he worked at Burger King, and he was a high school dropout. Well, he was on drugs. How does that work? Like, where did he end up? And then the Batman guy is the same way. He was obviously drugged out, wigged out, and programmed.
Yeah, I was just looking at just like I spent 5 minutes doing this. So I mean, but looking into the Uvalde, whatever that Texas
Uvalde, yeah.
Uvalde,
Yeah.
and then Sandy Hook. Where did these guys come from? What were their jobs? You know, you can't find that out. You know,
No.
it's pretty tough to find. I mean, they didn't work. You know, they were just their mom bought them a gun, or what about all the rounds? I mean, there's just it's amazing. I mean, this just it just keeps coming. You know, and then as much as I love May, she's a little blinded by the hippie scene and the left scene and stuff like that. I think.
Yeah, she
Because
is. Yeah.
I think she misses some stuff. I think she misses some stuff with, like, what was going on in some of these concerts and the LSD scene. I mean, they were pushing that shit, and they were pushing people, the kids and stuff, to go in and take the drugs. And I mean, tell you, man, I was a part of that thing, man. I was out there seeing the Grateful Dead and taking a bunch of acid and all that stuff. I mean, that was what we were supposed to do,
Right.
And so I think she misses a little bit of that. But anyway, I mean, but otherwise, man, she's so clear-eyed and right on. So
yeah, she does have a few blind spots. It's interesting to pick those up. And I don't talk about that too much because I just want to highlight the good work that she does, but she does definitely have a few blind spots. She doesn't recognize that the somehow, like, she's not connecting the LSD and the drug scene back to the CIA cultural change operation that they were trying to implement to steer the kids away from anti-war protesting, and then getting them to drop out of society and disconnect so that they could be managed, mind controlled. She only sees the positive side of the music scene and the really kind of tuned up to the hippie scene, right? The peace, love, and understanding, but missing out on, hey, there's this whole wet blanket of drugs and other things that they're trying to implement culturally across this generation. And you could see it as we grew up. They made specific shifts in culture, and it was, to me, almost like a decade type thing, where the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So they had they had the disco in the 70s, and then it changed to rock, and disco sucks. And then it changed to grunge, and then it changed to something else, and changed to something else. And I quit paying attention at some point, but nothing illustrates it more clearly for me than the transformation of Miley Cyrus from Hannah Montana, the multiple personality person, to Miley Cyrus, the whatever the hell she is now, right? That dragging the kids along in the generation, and to this like cultural Marxist wreck that we have now.
I just wanted to add to, I think maybe mentions this in one of the things where she's saying, well, what John Lennon represents in regard to the end of the anti-war movement and kind of the capstone of the end of that whole peace movement era, and to a large degree a new era of the regeneration of the defense industry from kind of being destroyed by the Vietnam War and its reputation as being as the American military as being kind of the premier military organization, to being kind of brought through the mud with the Vietnam era, and now Reagan's coming back, and there's going to be this new era. And so getting rid of Lennon and kind of the end of the peace movement was significant. And then the other side is like the dark side of the music industry, because the music industry is all about the mafia, and it leads to a lot of bad ends and manipulation, and there's just a lot of things behind the scenes in the music industry that any of those kind of loose ends, they're kind of tying them up. And certainly having somebody, a large figure like John Lennon, who pretty much was at the top of the game as far as the music industry is concerned, and getting rid of him also kind of send a message out to anybody that might be thinking to step out of line in the music industry. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so those kind of messages are in place. The other thing is like you mentioned with the chain, kind of creating the circumstance that like in every situation, they've got every angle covered, so like the doorman acts as the witness, he acts as the finger man, the media, everybody is in place and prepared to pull their particular trigger when their particular time comes. This is also kind of a demonstration of like how it's organized, and the way that the organization gauges its own operations. Is the operation functioning? Are all these different pieces functioning within the operation? And then they're able to evaluate and see, are people in the places that we've got them effective or not effective?
Yeah.
Do we need to get some new ones in those places?
Yeah, they're not opposed to getting new ones. And it reminds me of people like doing these impromptu interviews from people running away from the World Trade Center on 9/11, the impromptu man on the street interview of the guy who was reading a script.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Michael, the music industry, I mean, I think there's a big tie-in to the Hollywood industry, right? I mean, we know
sure.
that's so been corrupted from the get-go. I don't know. I mean, from what I kind of perceive, it's pretty screwed up.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the thing that just was pulled on in Acapulco here, the Anarchist HBO special, that money came from Hollywood, California, to talk about this group of people in Acapulco. These poor band of people in Acapulco that are anarchists. Where do they get millions of dollars to put on this HBO special? Hollywood. Where did that money come from? Obviously, got some ideas, but another thing she mentioned, I thought that was significant. And she mentions it coming from the Church Commission, was the idea that there are 400 agents in the organization that were currently in the media back during the church investigation time frame.
Mockingbird.
So they're getting their paychecks, and so I mean, in regard to the links in the chain, they're also providing all the paychecks for all those people in all those different areas. And if they don't do what they're saying, well, those paychecks are being pulled. And the thing is, like what you said, like you can get access to artwork, you can get access to free travel, you can get access to money and all kinds of other things.
Yeah, Epstein's harem, right?
And not having access to those things is really kind of the like if you screw up, if you don't play the game when your part is supposed to be played, that's the problem. So when these experts come out, when these witnesses come out, all these different circumstances in all those different links of the chain, this is part of the whole thing.
Just think about the links to the chain that were necessary for 9/11 to work, and then for the latest medical scam to work, right? Hey, you got to have $1 million in debt, Mr. Doctor, and you're going to toe the line or you're out and your career is ruined.
Well, I mean, I think to speak kind of what Michael's talking about here is that, yeah, that's certainly the case, but the control of the media, that's everything. Because they've got, whatever, 80%, 90% of the people, that's, they got them. I mean, when did that take place? Was it at the creation of the CIA? After the Nazis were brought into this country, and I mean that happened fast. Mockingbird was going on. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a great historian, but I mean that's pretty happened pretty quick.
Well, I would say, Amos, it was going on from the advent of newspapers, radio, television, and the internet. If you look at Edward Bernays and he was operating in the early 1900s using Freudian principles against people to convince them to go to war and then to convince them to buy cigarettes or whatever, right? And convince them to that these communists were trying to take over Central America because they didn't want United Fruit in there, taking all the land and murdering everybody. So I would say it's been going on really, really early, very sophisticated, and it'll be a good study to understand that.
Well, it was pretty cool. I was listening to the third John Lennon tape, which was pretty interesting, and she really wasn't covering a lot of the Lennon stuff.
Right.
She was talking about a few other things. One of which was she was saying, like, Walter Cronkite was just a big flipping liar, and everybody loves Walter Cronkite. I mean, I grew up thinking, my parents,
the most respected man in media.
Exactly.
Right. In the news.
And she's like, and she said, this guy's a fucking liar, and
if you look at evidence of revision, that documentary, and you see him talking about the Kennedy assassination, you can see that, right? You can see him lying. He and Dan Rather specifically, right? Or lying about it. And then he also was part of the World Federalism Group and tied in with David Rockefeller. So he was all about globalism and one world government. Cronkite. She had her finger on these people like from day one.
Well, it's truly amazing that, Lennon is assassinated and then she's like got a volume of information about all this stuff, like right there. And, the fact that the FBI and the news media and none of them touch this stuff.
No.
It blows your mind. In regard to that third tape, I think it's the December 28th broadcast, 1980. And she talks about going to groups and talking to them about, getting groups together to investigate stuff. And
based on what is that? What the diet, the Watchers, that's the whole World Watchers thing, which
World Watchers,
creating off of that. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Michael.
Yeah, well, the difficulty in getting people to pay attention and do the work that's necessary to like inform other people.
Yeah.
It's a thankless job, and there's there's a lot of other distractions, and we're talking like 1980. The distractions that you've got today versus the distractions you got in 1980, it's just no comparison. You got a lot more distractions and a lot more immediate distractions, but she's complaining back then of people just don't have the stamina to to do the work that's necessary to, to get this stuff out in front of other people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
It was based
this is a big
Weight
problem.
Watchers. That's what it was based on. Weight Watchers.
Weight
That's
Watchers,
when she
yeah.
went to World Watchers because she liked that formula. But I'm sorry,
Yeah.
man. I keep entering. I had a before I lost it again. I want to say it.
Yeah, well, all I'm saying is that that's a very interesting dialogue, and it's certainly some of the, it really brings forward, one of the biggest pieces as far as, what people are doing with their lives when they don't have the time. And she also mentions this idea of time, and like a time for everything. But if people take your time away from you, then you don't have time for all these different things to do. And so like when we're controlled, when our attention span is controlled by other people, and we never really understand the values and the motivations that are going on with our own behaviors, and how the mind control techniques are being used to facilitate the beliefs that are in our own head. It's an incredibly hostile environment at the moment for the truth.
It is.
And she was calling out people to say, hey, she broke it all down, just like I'm sorry, what's his Richard Grove does when he starts the whole, he breaks down the week, your hours and all of that, right? And she did the same thing. And she said, hey, wait, can you give an hour? Can you give an hour to this? Can you give 2 hours to this or whatever? The other thing I thought was pretty cool was she kind of broke out of her liberal mold where she was calling out the gun control people. Like they're calling for gun control when stuff like this happens. She says, no, man, you got to look at mind control.
Right. Right.
That was in that third tape too, which I'd love that because, man, that's right on, man,
Yeah. I mean, I thought that this series was just a tour de force. I mean, it was so interesting. There's so many avenues to pursue and things to understand about what she put together, and all the names and the villains, and there's very few heroes, but just calling this stuff out is heroic, right? And being able to stand up to it, and she paid the price, and so did John Lennon. But yeah, it's like she's not going to be silent about it. Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate you guys being here, getting to the top of the hour, and I love this discussion and everything you guys bring to it, and we'll keep it rolling. We'll keep on saying the truth as we know it.
Rob.
Tim, thank you.
Okay, guys.
Thanks, Tim.
Good night.
Good night.